Greetings, friends, and welcome to worship at Unity Church. Welcome to this time we set aside each week to join together as a free and inclusive religious community that supports our search for greater truth, meaning, and equity. We stand on the homelands of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations. We honor with gratitude the people who have stewarded the land throughout the generations and their ongoing contributions to this region. We acknowledge the ongoing injustices that we have committed against the Dakota and Ojibwe nations. And we wish to interrupt this legacy, beginning with acts of healing and honest storytelling about this place. This morning we worship both in person and online, a congregation gathered in time rather than in a single place. But may we all enter into worship fully, not held back by fear or distraction or the unfamiliarity of new ways. Welcome whatever arises in your spirit during this worship time we share. If this is your first time attending a service, we invite you to complete a visitor card available in the pews as well as online so that we can provide you with more information about our congregational life. Visitors are also welcome to attend Finding Yourself at Unity, a conversation each Sunday focused on a different topic about Unity Church. And today, the conversation will explore how we care for one another in community through Unity's pastoral and congregational care ministries. Unity's Mano a Mano community outreach ministry team is hosting Wellspring Wednesday this week, and we invite you to join them for Charango, a Bolivian tale of love and music. The evening will include a vegetarian dinner of Bolivian favorites, a short service in Ames Chapel, and the story of how the humble armadillo added his song to the forest choir, including music, crafts, and activities. Fun for all ages. After the service this morning, Merrill and I look forward to greeting those you present in person and invite you to visit the parish hall for refreshments and fellowship. Those joining us online are invited to Zoom coffee hour. And so now, let us enter into worship with the ringing of the bell.
Good morning. So when I have the privilege of standing up here, the one thing I can always promise you is candor. And I have a bit of a confession this morning. When we have Christian scripture in the services, I want to tell you confidentially that I have struggled with it. Reverend KP shared with me that we'd be talking about Jesus' parable of the sower today, and I thought, this service might be a tough one. I have a conflicted history with Christian narratives and institutions, and perhaps some of you do too. And that tends to put me on alert more than with our other Unitarian Universalist sources. I start erecting defenses in old ways by positioning myself in critique, trying to be sophisticated, mulling my little inventory of past grievances. How deeply funny, then, is it that this parable in particular, the one that describes hard or rocky ground versus fertile ground where a message dies or can take root, is so directly about opening oneself, about listening, and about open-hearted engagement. The irony is not lost on me. Many times my reticence is unfounded. The history of some Christian institutions may have very dark events, and that's true. But I think the true message is one of kindness and right relationship. And I'm always rewarded when I focus on the baby more than the bathwater. And I think that's what this is about. So I invite you this morning to open yourself with me to this great old story. Come, let us worship together. remain standing and join us in unison affirmation number 580 in the back of your hymnal. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. Please join us in a moment of silence.
Each time we gather for worship, we set aside a moment to expand the caring ministry of this congregation. Together we recognize the cycle of life and death, the circle of love, compassion, and witness that is at the center of this and every sacred community. We stand at the side of parents and teachers and all those whose primary spiritual practice is caring for children, with those who live with grief or chronic pain, with illnesses seen and unseen, with mental disability or addiction. We pray for our neighbors in prison, those who care for family members in ill health, those who are struggling to stay afloat in the midst of poverty. Our lives are blessed by those who knowingly and with curiosity and courage face their final days, and by those who rise above heartbreak to challenge oppression in all its forms. We pray for those in harm's way, for the wisdom and strength of the leaders of the world, and for the people of this courageous congregation, as together we live into our longing to embody and to help build the beloved community. And so will you pray with me for all these we now name? On the rare Sunday when we have no congregational news to share in our embracing meditation, we pause to celebrate the historic climate and health care bill that Congress passed on Friday and now heads to the president's desk to sign into law. Even as the measures in the Inflation Reduction Act represent a, quote, once-in-a-generation victory, we know that greater work, greater emissions reductions must follow. More must be done to shore up U.S. credibility in international climate negotiations and strengthen the collaborative work required of so many nations. So may we stand in compassionate solidarity with our neighbors here at home and all around our world. May they and may we be instruments of a just and lasting peace. I now invite you to speak aloud or hold in the silent sanctuary of your hearts the names of those you like to lift today in worship. And will you pray with me? Holy One, who is love, lover, and beloved, in this gathering that welcomes our gifts and our wounds, this place and moment that finds us at the moving frontier of who we are and our becoming, not only of self and one another, but of the possible and as yet unlived future. We gather to touch that embrace of love that roots us in a ground and horizon greater than ourself. To know our lives larger and more whole, more true, less cornered by the calculus of gains and losses amid the swirls of change. We find ourselves here to risk again touching a love as that force that disorganizes our lives, a love that offers itself as a site where our complexities and contradictions and conflicts can sit side by side, disordered and unresolved, and to know, as James Baldwin knew, that complexity is our only safety, and love is the only key to our maturity. And so, Holy One, grant to us an open heart and mind to risk touching a love that violates our own attachment to ourselves, a love that shapes our description and perception and action in risking new ways and new relationships, and that in touching such love, we may discover love's transformative character to give away what we cannot keep, that we might gain that which we cannot ever lose. A love that sets us again to the essential task for which we are here, to risk ourselves as seeds planted in the soil of both hardship and possibility. Amen. Each Sunday, your support of the church is an expression of the promises we make to one another and to the world. The contributions you make enable us to do the work that we have pledged to do within our church community and out in the world. Each Sunday, as you know, the majority of our offering is passed on to the community partners with whom we share common cause. If you would like to nominate an organization to receive our Sunday offering, please complete the nomination form found on Unity's website. This morning, the larger portion of our offering will be shared with Women's Advocates, an organization accompanying victims and survivors in their determination to break the cycle of domestic violence. Women's Advocates provides a continuum of safety, including extensive prevention and education outreach, emergency shelter, and advocacy services for victims fleeing violence, as well as wraparound assistance for survivors after they leave temporary shelter. This morning's collection will help close the budget gaps not underwritten by government and foundation support. Will the ushers please come forward? Please give as generously as you are able as we dedicate these offerings and ourselves to the greater work of the church, which is weaving a tapestry of love we call community.
Today, KP will talk about the parable of the sower, a story that appears in 3 of the Gospels. In it, Jesus describes that in spreading the good news, sometimes it'll land in a way that is heard fully, while other times it may not be heard or may not take root and flourish. It strikes me as a story about our readiness to hear, our readiness to be challenged. In a Christian context, the story may be interpreted specifically to mean hearing the gospel, but I understand it in a much broader context of truly hearing messages of justice, understanding, change, and reconciliation. And for me, that brings up notions of proximity, of isolation, and relationship. Without being in relationship with one another, I think it's hard for us to have the sort of openness that enables this hearing to happen. If you'll indulge me, I want to take us on a bit of a tangent. My family recently returned from a vacation in Houston, Texas. My wife, Denise, and I met and lived in the middle of Houston at Rice University and then in the Heights neighborhood from 1988 until 98. It struck me that Houston, maybe more than any other place, is a city where people want to be somewhere else. I don't mean somewhere else as in leaving the city, but when you're there, there's something about the structure of the city that is like, I don't want to be where I am. I need to be 40 miles away. With an area of 9,444 square miles, the Houston metro sprawls across flat land, unlimited by either geography or zoning, with great voids and tears of vacant land in the middle of it. It has this surreal freeway infrastructure that dominates everything. And it must have cost in the trillions of dollars to construct. Some deep drive caused people there to build in that way over generations, and to decide that that freeway system would be their modern Notre Dame. It is a city running away from itself. Returning there after almost 25 years and sharing that peculiar city with our kids brought me right back to the work of one of my Rice University School of Architecture professors, Albert Pope. I'll borrow heavily here from his book Ladders and his teaching, in which he describes a history of the shape of American cities. The way I remember it, Albert had a strong affection for the work of artist Robert Smithson. In 1970, Smithson created the earthwork spiral jetty in Utah's Great Salt Lake. I don't know if you know this earthwork sculpture. It's a large spiral that he made by progressively pouring rocks from a dump truck into a spiral. And he would back the truck as far around as he got to the end and then pour another load. It was designed to capture and accentuate the red algae that forms in the lake and colors the water red like blood or sometimes pink. Imagine a rock breakwater, but shaped almost like one of those walking meditation mazes. Smithson, coincidentally, was killed in a plane crash in Amarillo, Texas, a few years later. Albert Pope describes the transformation of many of our cities from the dense pre-automobile organic growth through the construction of uniform grids like this neighborhood, and then the disintegration of the grid into a ubiquitous form we all know now from the edges of American cities. The freeway, exit ramp, a large arterial, the entrance to a subdivision, a curved residential street, and then a cul-de-sac. The keen observer will see that this also forms a spiral. In some meta sense, this shape, freeway, artery, development entrance, cul-de-sac, traces an American ideal or aspiration where we all could live at the end of the street. In fact, many real estate developers use this subconscious notion both in planning housing communities and selling them, making as many spiral ends as they can design, because those places are perceived as desirable. Grids, with their uniform connection and continuous fabric, are almost never constructed anymore. There's a theme, even a contradictory sort of ideal of isolation in our dominant culture. If we examine the complicated relationship between the shape of our cities and towns, what architects sometimes call the urban fabric, and the shapes of our social structures, I can see this play out. Forces that guide the shape of cities' infrastructure, land ownership, subdivisions, institutions, and businesses are complex, and I don't want to overstate this, but they are bound up with some underlying ideals about how we should live. And for me, this ties to a whole range of other trends that, if anything, share a theme that we don't want to be bothered with one another. This specific narrative, and I know that this isn't true for everyone, but the story is out there and it's real, is that ideally we will be separated. We will have the power to control with whom we enjoy associating by living in private at the end of the road. It might parallel the allure of self-serve gas pumps. Have you seen this joke where it says, "Please see attendant on the gas pump"? And the driver says, "Oh, I don't think so. I'm going to drive a mile," rather than go inside there. Amazon.com, phone trees, the solitary freedom of the automobile, which is one of my great loves, Twitter, the machinery that delivers limitless products to us while concealing the people who make and deliver those products, ways we can withdraw from the inconvenience of being forced together. Back to the sower. If relationship is a key to really hearing one another and to hearing the news, then what might it mean that we no longer answer our phones? I'm not above or apart from this question. I like my comfort. I like not to be bothered. I'm a classic introvert, happy to revel in my time alone or just with my own family. But I don't think that this is a question to place along that axis of introversion, extroversion, because it's really about the deeper type of connections that all of us need to open ourselves to one another. So I'm learning to be a little suspicious about this spiral impulse in myself, and to try to identify and question it. When am I, or in what ways am I holding on to that spiral ideal, separating myself? And in what ways does that close me off?
The African Methodist Episcopal denomination was organized in 1816 as the first independent black denomination by the educator, minister, and freed slave Richard Allen. As the oldest AME church in the South, Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church is often referred to as Mother Emanuel. And Mother Emanuel is well known in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina's most historic city, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired, in the first state to secede from the Union. Charleston, that had once been home to the nation's highest ratio of enslaved black people to whites, where an estimated 40% of America's slaves came through its harbor. On the evening of June 17th, 2015, 7 years ago, the parishioners who had gathered for their regular Bible study had just barely opened their Bibles when a young white man entered their fellowship hall. It wasn't unusual for strangers to venture inside, even white ones. After all, a college campus sat just a few blocks away, with thousands of mostly white young adults on foot and bicycles, including some who occasionally stopped in to pray or learn about the church's important civil rights history. Reverend Pinckney welcomed the visitor. "Are you here for our Bible study?" And the visitor nodded. Reverend Pinckney handed the young man a Bible so he could follow along and pulled out a chair beside him for the visitor to take a seat. And there, they all settled in. The study leader for the evening was Myra Thompson. And they opened their Bibles to a passage in the Gospel of Mark, the 4th chapter, known as the parable of the sower. What is the reign of God like? Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly since it had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell into good soil and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. The room became stuffy, and they quickly exceeded the half hour that they had planned for the study. But it was Myra Thompson's enthusiasm that carried them along as she described a world in which hatred and greed and fear had come to harden people's hearts, leaving people and communities unable to nourish those precious seeds of truth and grace to yield healing for themselves and for the wider world. As a people of faith, as a church, they needed to provide fertile ground, she said, for those seeds to bear fruit. The visitor sat quietly as the study continued for almost an hour. At 9 o'clock, the group began a closing prayer. Their heads were bowed, their eyes closed. The visitor did not close his eyes. According to Jennifer Berry Hawes, the journalist, the visitor would later say that he had wavered. The people seemed so nice. But his mission was too important, he concluded, the moment too pivotal for the salvation of the white race. He had arrived with a handgun, 88 bullets, and hopes of starting a race war. He decided that he had to go through with his mission. U.S. Attorney Jay Richardson brought 33 counts of federal hate crimes. And in his opening statement, he introduced the members of the church killed as their pictures were shown to the jury. The Reverend Clement of Pinckney, pastor, husband, father, and state senator. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr., wise spiritual guide. Reverend Sharonda Singleton, a ray of sunshine, loving mother, track coach. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, singer, whose 4 young daughters always brought milkshakes into the church. Cynthia Hurd, wife, sister, librarian. Ethel Lance, grandmother, dedicated church usher. Susie Jackson, called Aunt Susie by everyone, proud matriarch of the sprawling Jackson family. Tawanza Sanders, 26, a man just beginning to see the promise of an extraordinarily bright future. And the 9th, Myra Thompson, leading her very first Bible study that evening. Dylan Roof's massacre of 9 innocents during their closing prayer horrified our nation. The visitor that night had listened attentively during the nearly hour-long study to a parable about the seeds of a new reality being planted all around us, some falling on unreceptive and hostile soil, some seeds falling on fertile soil and bringing forth a new and astounding reality. Clearly, the visitor did not have ears to hear, or the parable has somehow not succeeded in what it had purposed. Or perhaps the parable isn't finished with us yet. Maybe the parable is still at work. Maybe the study is still going on, still speaking and struggling to be heard, its meaning to be plowed and cultivated until we can finally hear its message. I'm not talking just the parable of Mother Emanuel in Charleston, but the parable of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, the parable of the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, the parable of the Walmart in El Paso, the parable of the Tops Friendly Market in Buffalo, and the many more parables about where we are as a people, as a nation. Parables about the topography of our lives, parables stitched with one common thread: the violence of white supremacy. In marking the 7th anniversary of the martyrdom of the Mother Emanuel 9, national faith leaders have asked congregations across denominations to study and reflect on the parable of the sower. To listen and to grapple with the parable the parishioners were studying that fateful evening. What does the parable mean in light of Mother Emanuel? Does the parable speak to us here at Unity Church-Unitarian? What kind of soil are we? What kind of soil are we being called to become? Myra Thompson had chosen the parable as a text to lead her very first study, and she spent days preparing, grappling with the parable. She said to her husband earlier in the week, "I just don't get this." He reassured her, you'll get it, just stay with it. But Myra Thompson was just not getting it. But she had enough humility to know that parables, by genre, refused our desire to domesticate them into pious platitudes for easy consumption, as parables were more intent on complexifying than clarifying, less interested in explaining anything to our satisfaction than calling attention to the unsatisfactoriness of all our previous explanations and understandings. It seemed obvious to Myra Thompson that parables would be the pedagogy of choice by a prophet and rabbi who was himself practically an ambulatory parable. He went around cursing fig trees for no apparent reason, planted coins in the mouth of fish, had a screwball way of calculating how a crowd of 5,000 could be fed with 5 sandwiches and 2 sardines, asked us to love and pray for those hateful enemies. And in one of the most disturbing parables about a Good Samaritan, told us that your neighbor is someone who is not like you. The teachers seem to like nothing better than placing 2 things right alongside one another, to literally parabolen, but things that no one in their right mind would ordinarily put side by side, sort of like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. 2 divergent realities that do not sit well together in our minds and hearts, asking us to wrestle and wonder, to imagine otherwise. Theologian Clarence Jordan once put it this way: whenever a parable is told, a stick of dynamite is lit and covered with a story. Miss Myra Thompson knew something about parables, about 2 divergent realities that do not sit well in our minds. You see, as a black woman in South Carolina, with a Confederate flag flying on the state capitol building for more than 77 years, until Governor Nikki Haley would later sign a bill removing that flag, Miss Myra Thompson was all too familiar with the tenacious and determined non-comprehension that human beings are absolutely capable of. That white ignorance has nothing to do with lack of or absence of knowledge. It was a willful, structural, group-based miscognition, an inability to apply knowledge and history of racism to our specific cases and lives, an attachment to narratives that obscure reality and trade in actively maintaining false beliefs. False beliefs like 9/11 was the deadliest attack ever perpetrated on American soil. False beliefs like the U.S. is the world's greatest democracy, rather than a political system consistently threatened and undermined by our history of disenfranchising people of color. In a 2017 study entitled "Producing Color Blindness: Everybody's Mechanisms of White Ignorance," sociologist Jennifer Mueller asked 105 undergraduates to analyze their families' intergenerational wealth, using concepts that they had just learned in class, such as the racial wealth gap, the historically discriminatory asset-building policies that existed from slavery to Jim Crow, like housing mortgage discrimination, to school segregation and student debt, to mass incarceration and environmental racism, to tax codes that give preferential treatment to certain assets and savings that favor white Americans and not black Americans. Simply stated, students were asked to write an explicitly racial history of their family's wealth transmission. And Mueller was absolutely fascinated to see 4 maneuvers by which students creatively bypassed racial awareness, reestablished ignorance, and maintained their color blindness. The first maneuver, evasion. Evasion of any race-based understanding, with students presenting their data devoid of any language relating to race or racism. This was especially striking considering that the assignment and their grade required race-based analysis, even if nothing other than to simply state the absence of racism. Second maneuver, a willful blindness that introduced alternative factors to neutralize any evidence of white privilege. For example, one student acknowledged the benefits of her white family received from discriminatory housing policies, acknowledged that, but given that her family were immigrants who lacked proficiency in the English language, ultimately rejected white privilege as contributing to her family's wealth. Third maneuver, honest-to-goodness ignorance, where students would admit their family's race-based privilege. They would admit that, but insisted that their family members and ancestors were genuinely ignorant and could not have possibly known the moral implications of the policies from which they benefited. And the fourth and final maneuver, mystification, in which students offered cogent, critical racial analysis, but then claimed they didn't know what to do about racism because it was just too embedded for society to change. They doubted that there were any significant solutions whatsoever. Miss Myra Thompson thought she wasn't getting the parable, but maybe she understood more than she realized. Those seeds that fell by the wayside, maybe that's exactly what we do with a disturbing and inconvenient truth. Let it fall by the wayside. Nothing to take so seriously. Strictly for the birds. Seeds of truth scattered all about us, but forms of misperception actively maintained and reinforced, lest it expose us to our collective and personal culpability. Lest it trouble us with studies after studies that show how whites are more likely to see a weapon in the hand of a black man than a white man. The truth that our very perception is an interrelated structure of reality, that our very seeing itself is caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and therefore that no one can see truly without distortion unless we learn to see together. Maybe that's what we as a congregation needed to ask one another during the ministerial search process. Questions about our perceptions of church, of ministry. Across many conversations, I heard many of us express our search for a senior minister who can preach well, who can attend to the multiple pastoral needs of a large congregation. And I saw no one disagree with that. We all seem to agree on the value of good preaching. But when perceptions diverged on whether what we actually heard from the pulpit was good preaching or not, I didn't hear us ask what we believed was true about good preaching. We seem to value good preaching, but unclear about what we believed was true about good preaching. We seem to value good pastoral care, but unclear about what we believed was true about what makes up good pastoral care. And maybe that shouldn't be surprising, given our non-creedal faith tradition, more clear about our values what we think is good, than we are about our beliefs, our deeply held convictions about what we hold as true. But the parable asks us to question deeper, to dig deeper into the sources of ministry, into our theology of preaching and pastoral care and community outreach. However thorny and complicated those conversations may get, lest our vision and criteria and expectation for senior ministerial leadership spring up quickly, without depth of soil, without deep rootedness. And when the sun got too hot in the complexity and conflict, our vision and hope and sense of shared ministry get scorched and withers away. Miss Myra Thompson thought she wasn't getting this parable, but maybe she's helping all of us to listen more deeply, more vulnerably, more humbly. This parable seems straightforward enough. The 4 kinds of ground are clearly meant to cover the sorts and conditions of reality that is hostile and unreceptive to the work of building a new reality. The seeds of this reign of God fall on all types of ground, catches all kinds. There is nothing narrow or parochial, nothing siloed into our spirals and cul-de-sacs in the workings of this sower of seeds. In fact, come to think of it, the parable makes us wonder if the sower is actually in his right mind at all, if he actually knows what he's doing. Precious seed is hard to come by in arid first century Palestine. And a careful farmer would have prepared the ground, removed the rocks and weeds, mark off neat rows, carefully placed each seed 6 inches from the next one, cover each with 3/4 of an inch of soil. You know, right? But this one tosses seed about like someone standing in the parking lot at Walmart, where the pigeons will get at it if thousands of busy feet or truck tires don't grind it into the pavement first. What on earth is he thinking? He should narrow his focus and concern, narrow his scattering. Except there's nothing narrow about this sower of seeds. You see, people who are narrow, with our parochialism properly in place, don't really listen to what other people say. Rather, they sniff at the words, checking them over and over to spot the squishy, rotten spots through which ideas that we fear and hate might seep in. Narrowness demands that our stories be airtight, leak-proof, like what some people believe ought to be about our Constitution. The Constitution should have every right and freedom enumerated and made clear as to which substantive rights are and are not deeply rooted in this nation's history or tradition. And so adhering to a principle called originalism that will somehow safeguard the Constitution by keeping it airtight, sealed off, leak-proof from any interpretation or meaning other than at the time it was adopted. And so lifeless and dead. This past June, members of Congress invoked the Second Amendment and what they saw as its original meaning to oppose a bill that would raise the minimum age to purchase an AR-15 style automatic rifle from 18 to 21. They were seizing on an earlier court decision from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to support their argument. In the court's decision, 2 of the 3 judges appointed by our previous president, they relied on originalism to block a California statute that would raise the minimum age from 18 to 21. 2 of those 3 judges ruled that the Second Amendment protects Americans' right to carry weapons as citizens did back in 1789. And that, quote, colonial militias almost always included all men 18 and older, end quote. Missing from their analysis were multiple doses of reality. Not the least of which is that in militias then and now, young people operate under the command of elders. Moreover, as the Second Amendment states, militias were, quote, well regulated. Neither of these conditions apply to the lone gunman under the age of 21 on a murderous rampage. We could go on. But according to the nonprofit Every Town for Gun Safety, 18 to 20-year-olds are responsible for homicides at 3 times the rate of adults 21 and older. Human brain, it seems, requires time to mature. Just 3 days after the judge's rule to block the statute to raise the minimum age, an 18-year-old white supremacist used an AR-15 to kill 10 innocent black shoppers at the Tops Friendly Market in Buffalo. 10 days after that, an AR-15 was also the weapon chosen by the 18-year-old who killed 19 children and 2 teachers in Uvalde, Texas. In weaponizing originalism, we weaponize our narrowness, a narrowness that imprisons us to our fears, our delusions, our misperceptions, a narrowness that robs us and our children of safety and hope and the promise of a new way of being. A racialized and weaponized set of priorities, perspectives, investments, and desires born of our colonial past and these ongoing projects of white supremacy. But far from originalism or any other form of narrowness, parables are wondrously porous and permeable, as is the human body, breathing, leaking, exposed to the world and our neighbors around us, open to all sorts of perceptions, interpretations, and viewpoints, and into the field of rocks and thorns, hardened pathways and shallow ground. This sower went out to sow without any sense of narrowness, any sense of small-mindedness or pettiness of heart, with nothing other than the messy, divine recklessness of a radical and generous hospitality that would plant seeds wherever it could, even on that fateful night when such dangerous hospitality would welcome a stranger into Mother Emanuel. Friends, the answer to any parable is magnanimity, is greatness of soul. For the reign of a new reality always begins with a reckless gamble born of such magnanimity, born of such greatness of soul, that against the hostile and unreceptive background we find all around us, you and I, we are parables who have not ceased imagining the fullness of promise that surpasses any measure by 30, 60, and 100-fold. So what wild and unexpected seeds are you holding in your hands today, calling you to imagine slinging seeds of a new reality everywhere as you laugh and dance with disordered gospel delight? What is the reign of the new promise like? It is like us. You and I are the sower and the seeds and the soils. We are the whole parable, just as this moment in the life of our congregation and the life of this world is a parable. You will be utterly lost if all that you bring to parables is narrowness. For what a parable is intended to do is to break open our hearts and souls. The only answer to a parable is magnanimity. It is greatness of soul. And with that, we will understand this parable. We will preach it. We will plant seeds. And we will harvest an astounding harvest. May it be so. Amen.